call Grant Roberts.
Todd Muller leading the applause for Paul Foster Bell's valedictory speech there. Mr. Speaker, I was fortunate enough to grow up in the working class community of South Dunedin. And that's bounded on one side by the very rugged, robust coastline where St Kilda and St Clair Beach are, and I went to primary school and intermediate school and secondary school on the flat land there. And the other boundary of South Dunedin was my beloved Carisbrook, where I would go and see the Otago rugby team have some huge wins and the odd loss here and there as well. And right next door to Carisbrook was the Hillside Workshop. And when you'd go down to Carisbrook, you'd see the mainly men, but some women of the Hillside Workshops coming down to get their afternoon tea from the shops in that area. They were a core part of that community as I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, a community where people looked after each other, where people had decent work and decent wages and participated in their community. That was what South Dunedin was like. And over time, the Hillside Workshops built itself up from being mainly a hard industrial base to being a technology company. There were still those people there on the factory lines building up those railway wagons, but the designers were there as well. It was a sophisticated engineering company, and it kept help building that South Dunedin community. And then this government came along and said, we'll take the cheap option. We'll take the cheap option on the railway wagons. We're not going to back New Zealand workers. We're not going to back strong communities like South Dunedin. We're going to take the cheap road. And you know what happened, Mr. Speaker? Hillside went down the gurgler. The railway wagons, the wheels literally fell off them. They fell off them and they had to be fixed again. And that's what you get when you take the cheap road, when you don't invest in New Zealanders. This piece of legislation gives us the chance to say we back New Zealand workers, but even more than that, Mr. Speaker, it gives us the chance to say that we back strong communities. We back strong communities right around New Zealand to say we'll help put decent jobs in place. We know on this side of the House that creating jobs is something that happens right across the community. Fantastic private sector companies creating jobs every day. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? The government can do its bit. We contract $40 billion worth of goods and services every year as a government, everything from IT products through to railway wagons. The government does that, and governments all around the world say, how can we make use of that process to back our people, to create decent jobs? And what this piece of legislation says is, when the government's thinking about how to do that, it thinks about Kiwis. It thinks about communities like South Dunedin, and it says, how can we do our best by them? This lot over here might not care about that. They might not care about those communities like South Dunedin and the regions of New Zealand, but we do on this side of the House. And we're going to back them with the goods and services that this government buys. Paul Foster Bell wanted to tell us a lecture about Wellington. Well, those IT companies in Wellington should be getting a share of the IRD computer system upgrade. There are people, they are not. There are people who can do coding, there are people who can do programming, and they're not getting to do it, Mr. Hudson, because Accenture is doing that through the Philippines. They're not doing that coding work in New Zealand. It's time to get creative with those contracts, break them up, put them into chunks. It's actually better procurement practice, Mr. Speaker, to break a big contract like that up into chunks and give New Zealand firms a fair go. There's companies in Wellington like Boost and Story Inc. who got their start doing contracts for the public service and have gone on to be major exporters of services. This will enable more companies to get that kind of role. Mr. Speaker, this is an important piece of legislation, because what it symbolises is a Labor Party that is prepared to put our money where our mouths are when it comes to supporting decent work, strong communities and a fair go for everyone in New Zealand. It is time in New Zealand that we backed our people, we backed our companies, and we put decent work for New Zealanders at the top of our agenda. That's what the next Labor government will do. This kind of legislation will pass when we come into government next year.
I call Brett